and welcome to Making Hose. Whenever you're making hose, you need the person there that you're going to be making them for, as the hose need to fit really snugly down the leg. You also need them either in shorts or in brays. Wearing tights will just about work because again, we're fitting closely. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my measurements. The measurements you need are going to be in the comments underneath the video, but I'll talk you through them as well. So the first measurement I'm going to do is round his thigh. It doesn't really matter which leg you go for, we're going to be fitting them individually to both. So I'm going to take my measurement without seam allowance. As I said in the other drapery videos, I always do it in inches. That just helps me with my seam allowance. So I'm going to go for 20 inches there. And I'm writing them down as I go. The next one I'm going to take is the knee. So we're going to go with 15 for that. I have to admit, with hose measurements, we're going to do so much fitting that they're not as important or need to be as precise as tunic ones. So just whiz through them. And then I'm going to do the widest point of his calf, which is again is 15. So he's got very symmetrical legs. I'm now going to do, that's all I need for going around the legs, because as I said, most of my measuring is going to come in with my fitting. I'm then going to be measuring down. Now I'm going to now go from his hip, the top of where the hose is going to fit, all the way to the bottom of his foot. Now, it's really important that you do get this measurement long enough, because you cannot really work them if they're too short, but we can always cut a bit off. So you want this to come in where they're going to be tied to his brays. Whereabouts is that on you? There we go, about there. So if you just hold that there with one hand, and go all the way down, right to the floor. I'm going to go with 44, like that. So I'm now going to be measuring down from his hip to his thigh. Again, I'm just judging this because this is only to help with my drawing. So I'm going to say that's around 13 there, where it's going to be coming to around his leg. So let's get that down. I'm then going to be going down to his knee. So that's at around 23 there, 24. Again, that's just for me. And then down to his calf. Oh, I'm happy with that. I'm now going to add my seam allowance. So the ones I'm adding seam allowance to are the overall length and any of my measurements going round his leg. And I'm also going to need to halve the ones going round. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to halve the measurements going round. So my thigh was 20, that's going to be 10. And I'm going to add, to be really safe, 2 inches of seam allowance to everything, because I know I want it baggy so I can shape it properly to his leg. So that's going to be 12. My next one is the knee, which is 15, 7.5 add 2, 9.5, and his calf was exactly the same. I'm then just going to add 2 inches to my hip to floor measurement, just so it's far too long and absolutely safe. I have to admit, I'm being overcautious here, because there's nothing worse than making a leg too small. But if you're more confident, feel free just to be adding 1 inch to those. I'm now going to be drawing and cutting out the leg of the hose. Now, you need your fabric when you're cutting it and folding it to be on the bias. So this means it's diagonal. So if I show you, when I've just got my fabric, if I just have it straight along the weave and along the warp and weft, there is very little stretch in it. But as soon as I make it diagonal, I get a lot more stretch in it. And you want to be using all of that stretch in your garment here, because it's that will get you the really good fit around the leg. So what I'm doing, rather than just having my fabric straight and folding it over straight, I'm folding it on a diagonal. And this means I will be using that bias along the length of the leg. So that's the first thing to do, is to get it folded on the diagonal. And you're cutting it out from that piece. If you're using tiny scraps, so if you're just sometimes making like a lady's pair of stockings, you can get away with it if it's a thin fabric and you don't have much, but it is preferable to make it on the bias. So there we go, I've folded that diagonally. I'm now going to be checking with my measurements that I've folded it wide enough at every point. So this will be my top bit. My length, because we've been really cautious, is going to be far too long, at 46. So that's, first thing I'm going to do is mark to here at 46. I'm using dressmaker's chalk. I've got it in a pencil. If you want a cheaper option, just a bit of any dressmaker's chalk will do perfectly well, but I quite like this because I can be really precise. And I'm going to check that's wide enough. Now for your ankle at this stage, If you just make it to the calf measurement, it will fit. If you go about an inch smaller, it's no disaster. Now, this measurement here is actually quite big. I've got 10.5 there, so I'm, just to save fabric, going to roll that back ever so slightly, because there's no point me wasting anything at this stage. So there you go, that measurement, oh, that's now 9, so I'm going to be happy with that at the bottom. I'm now going to be marking the other measurements I drew down the length of his leg. So I started at the top, remember, so I need to mark these measurements down. So my first one was 13 for the calf. I'm drawing on this, absolutely plenty, so I can really see those marks. Just to remind you, make sure you're drawing on the wrong side of the fabric. So often with wool, the fabric will be quite different on either side. You want the side that shows the weave the best. I have to say I got lucky with this one because they're really similar on both sides, so it doesn't actually matter. But make sure any marks you're doing are going to be on the wrong side, they're going to be on the inside. And you also want to make sure all your pieces are cut out of the same side of the fabric, or otherwise you'll have one foot that looks a bit odd and you'll be able to see the difference. Okay, so I've measured down to where the thigh comes in. I'm now going to measure down to the knee, which is 23 here. I'm measuring down now to the calf at. Okay, so I've now got my measurements going down. It's now that I can begin to draw the overall shape. So now I'm marking on my measurements halfway across the leg. So I'm going to start off with my 12. I'm then going to go down and mark, it was 9.5, and then we were keeping this straight again at 9.5 here. I can draw out to here. Again, I was keeping this about the same. And now I can begin to join up the points at the back of the leg. So, as I said, this is really rough. We're going to be doing most of the fitting later, but this just gives me some shape. You now need to draw to where the top of the leg is attached, and this forms a little tab like this at the front. This is something you just get used to drawing. So if you look at the curve I draw, to fit it round the back of the leg, I come in and I'm going to make almost like an elongated S coming up and round. That's maybe slightly wide. I can bring it in just a little bit more, but that's something then I can be changing with the fit. You will get used to drawing that shape, and if you're nervous at all, you can put it on them and then draw the line. You'll get a bit intimate around the back of them, to be honest, but you want that then to be just sitting at the back of their leg. Okay, I'm now going to get cutting that out. Okay, when I've got down to the end here, I'm going to be cutting out just a little shape for it to fit. I'll draw it first so you can see, but it needs to have a gap at the front for it to fit over the foot. So you just draw out just a little bit like that. We can make that bigger later if we want to. And I just chop that straight out now, then I know it's going to fit. Right, so I've got one leg shape. I'm only cutting out one at this point because I'll make the other when I fitted this one. And then I know that I won't be wasting that much fabric. I'm now just going to whiz along the back to machine this up. I'm now machining together just down the back of the hose. I'm going to do it really quickly. One thing to bear in mind though is the fabric can want to move, and the last thing you want is any twist developing. So if it goes off a little bit, you can end up with these lines. However, sometimes if your cutting hasn't been that precise, and I have done this roughly, it does need to move a little bit. So just be careful as you're sewing it that all the fabric is still straight. Right, let's whiz through this. So now I'm going to put it straight back on him and begin drawing on it so I can get the fit much better. This is my rough shape, and you'll see why I leave plenty of seam allowance on it, because it's surprising how tight they can get. What I'm now going to be doing is I'm going to be pinching my way down and drawing a line to where I think it should go with the fit. What you want, ideally, with a pair of hose is to be able to see the calf muscle through at every point. I have to admit, this is the point where you need to know the person you're measuring, because you are being fairly intimate. So this bit up here is actually nearly tight enough. I don't want it too tight that it's cutting any, blood off at the thigh at all. However, you do want them to stay up a bit on their own so they're not just slipping down. So I'm just pinching as I go and drawing. Another point where you don't want it too tight is the knee, because he will not be able to bend his leg. So that is a bit where you do want to actually give plenty of room. I can then keep drawing down. I'm really pinching. You also don't want it too tight at the ankle or they will not be able to get their foot through. So it needs to be fitted, but not to the point where they're really struggling to get it on. Okay, so now I've got that line drawn down, I'm going to go back and machine that line. I've done my second machine and you'll see already it's looking a lot tighter. One thing that is already developed is, do you see here, it's a little bit off the floor and it's not quite going down. So I need to cut the gap for the foot just a little bit higher. I can reshape it when it's off him, but I want these bits of fabric at the edge of the hose sitting at the right place now, or otherwise all my drawing is going to be to the wrong place. So again, that's just about there. When I cut that, I'll cut it slightly higher. Okay, so I can now keep fitting. It's still just a little bit loose back at the top of the leg, so I'm going to be drawing it again. Don't worry how many attempts it takes you. I often do 4 or 5 fittings to get it just right with the machining. There's no problem in that at all. It's so much better to take your time over it and not have to do loads of unpicking, because it's a long length to unpick. So just as before, I'm pinching it tight to get it really fitted. Now it's already quite fitted here, but I really want it so you can't actually pinch any loose fabric at the back. That's how you know you've got an amazing pair of hose, when you can see the calf muscle and you can't pinch anymore. Okay, so now he's going to take it off and I'm going to machine that line again. I've machined it again and actually I'm getting quite happy with the fit. This now fits tight enough with the cuff, so if he lets go, it's not going to just fall down, which is what we want at the top. He can still move his leg with his knee, although that could possibly come in slightly tighter here, because there's just this little bit of bagginess. And then on the calf, it's looking good, but I'm going to tighten it just a little bit. I'm not going to do any more tightening on the ankle here, because it was already a little bit of a squeeze to get it on. You want them to have to wriggle their foot in, not just slide them on. But if it gets to be a real strain, then you've got it too tight. So all I'm going to do is just draw a little bit of a line and do a tiny bit of tightening. I like to draw, when I'm only doing a little bit of the length, a line straight across, so I know that's where I'm starting. In fact, I might go slightly higher and bring it in just a little bit about the knee. So I'll go from there, tighten it down again, I'm pinching. It's now taking quite a bit of effort for me to pinch, so I'm just going to bring that in a little bit and I'm going to stop there. So I've got that really clearly drawn out, the length that I'm going to. I'm now happy with the fit of this. You can see his calf muscle through. If he lets go a second, it's not moving at all, which is what you want, and he is still just about able to get it on and off. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the excess off and use this as a template to make the next leg. I've got ready now my fabric to cut out the next leg. I always do this having fitted the first one, because then you don't need so much excess and it'll be a lot faster to fit. One thing to be mindful of is I've got my fabric on the bias. This fabric has got a slight stripe to it, so I'm making sure I've got the other leg with the stripe going the same way, otherwise they don't really look like a pair. Also, when I'm laying this leg on, it's really easy to bring it just a little bit further over, and then the second leg turns out smaller. And as this leg is fitted perfectly, that's the last thing we want. So I always leave about a centimetre, half a centimetre, so I know that this leg is big enough. And I'm going to draw around this with a little bit of space. It's the right length, I know that, and I can draw in the curve that I cut out before. But if I just go a little bit out, if his legs are slightly different sizes, as people's normally are, I've still got plenty of room to work with. But what this is useful for is I'll just have less fitting to do, and that's coming up to the same point. The top is going to be exactly the same. My next step, I'm going to cut this out, and as I did before, just machine straight down the back and then fit this one in exactly the same way. The next thing I'll show you on the video though is doing the feet once you've done both legs. I'm now going to draw around the soles of his feet to get the base of the foot section. I'm going to do this individually for each foot. What you want to be doing is have placed their foot on the fabric. I've just managed to find a scrap here which is wide enough, and you only need to be leaving about 1/2 inch to 1 inch around. So if you see, I'm just drawing around the edge of his foot. You won't be able to see it around the back here, but I'm doing exactly the same as I do on this side. And you don't have to make these as big as you think. If you do make them just a little bit small, it's only a little bit of fabric to redo them, but I find it's a lot easier to make them to the right size. So if you see, it's probably, only 1/2 inch to 1 inch there around. I'm then going to now do that with the other foot and get them chopped out. Now, do we have enough room on this piece of fabric? Moving the foot gently over. Yes, we just about do. Do try and use up scraps for this bit. There is no reason not to, because they're only little bits. I'm now going to get both of those cut out. I'm now going to do the top part of the foot. For this, the easiest way of doing it is just laying the fabric over the foot. I often start with a corner of the fabric because you need a point that's going to fit up the top. We will shape that further when we're sewing it in because it might not fit in so neatly, but if you start with a right angle, it's a good place to go. You need to bring it up enough that it's going to sit down by the side of the foot. If you think about where the hoe came to, there we go. So that's about the shape we're going to do, and I'm just going to draw around, making sure it's touching the floor on both sides. Again, I'm leaving about 1/2 inch to 1 inch. So there's going to be plenty of room for seam allowance. But again, you don't want to make these massively too big. If the feet are too big, they won't fit in their shoes right, and it'll just be very uncomfortable. So I've got that shape. I'm now going to cut that out, and then I'll do the other one. The first bit you're going to sew in is the sole of the foot. And you want to place this is the back seam here, this is the front of the foot. You want to place the back of the foot right into the back, make it symmetrical, and we're going to sew one way and then the other. You need to ease this in because we want to keep the curve here and not flatten any of that out. So let me show you. So I'm going right onto the seam. I'm going to sew nice and slowly, easing it round to keep that curve. I'm going to reinforce all of my stitches when I end on this bit because this is a section that is going to be put under pressure. So you'll notice I've done one side, I'm now going to do the other side exactly the same. So starting right at the back of the seam, if you leave a little gap you can always hand stitch it, but I like to go as far up as I can. And as I just did before, we're going to be easing it round. Nice and slowly. Reinforcing the end bit by going forward and backwards. The next thing I'm going to do, now I've got the foot on, is sew on the top part of the foot. And we're easing that bit, this point, into this gap. Now, this is exactly the same skill you do if you're ever sewing in a front and back gore. So if you're good at this, you'll be fantastic at that. I'm going to sew it one side first. So I get the point right up into the top here. And the first one is the easiest one to do. We're just sewing straight down that side of the foot. It doesn't matter if this is slightly too long. Remember, we gave plenty of room in the seam allowance. So this is the first thing to do. This one's the easier one. Of just sew it straight down that side. Okay, so I've got to the seam. So I'm stopping, I've got this little bit of excess, but I'm not too worried about that right now. Now what I need to do is sew this other side. Now you need to be stretching this top bit as you sew. It's really easy to end up with a little lump going on, and you don't want that. So if you see with my hands, I'm pulling this top bit, not so tight that I'll tear upwards, and I'm easing the fabric out here. I'm going to sew a tiny bit, look at it on the right side, and see if I've got the lump, because if you have, don't bother sewing the rest. There's no point. You'll just be wasting your time. So let's get that. Okay, so I've sewn a little bit. I'm going to go back. I'm going to check. I've got the lump. Don't worry about all the extra thread. And if I turn this round, you can see that this is the top here, and I don't have any lumps. It's just a smooth curve. That bit is tricky to sew in. It does take a bit of practice, so don't worry if you're finding it hard the first time you do it. You will get there, I promise. So now I'm going to sew down the rest of that length, making sure I'm not catching any extra lumps of fabric. You might need to stretch it out and ease it a bit as you go to get it into the curve. Now I've sewn it all the way around. If you're nervous at this point, it's a really good point to try it on his foot and just check that it's all going in still. I'm quite happy with this, so I'm just going to keep going. The next stage you're going to do is sewing around the foot. Now you need to be really careful when you do this that you're not leaving lots of excess. You're going to end up with a lump on this side. So as you're sewing, you need to have your eye on the end goal. If you've got a bit flapping out at this point, we're not too worried about that. We'll just leave that flapping. We left plenty of room before. And with this one, often it's best just to go for it, sew the two bits together and see where you end up. I've got my eye on my end goal, as I said, so I know that I'm not going to end up with too much excess on one side. I'm feeling all the time underneath that I'm getting the right bit sewn onto the right bit and stretching out as I go, so I know, right, that's going to end up being sewn to that bit. See, by the time I'm getting onto this length, I know that I've got this bit straight, so I'm not going to have any lumps. I've done my stretching around there. And I've got to the end. As I did before, I'm going to reinforce it, because again the foot is put under a lot of pressure. Now's the time I'm going to try it on. So I've checked, the foot goes on, and I'm actually quite pleased with the fit so far. It's not pulling too much at the top. He's got a little bit of room up here. It's fitting really nicely on that side. So the last thing I'm going to do is just a little bit of shaping here at the front. You don't want to fit the foot too tight because it will get uncomfortable. But as I said earlier, if you've got a little bit of bagginess there, too much bagginess, it will be uncomfortable inside his shoe. So I'm just drawing a little bit of a line where I'm going to fit it, and I'll just go and machine that. After I've done that, the only things I need to do is try it on again, and I can keep fitting the foot until I'm happy with it. So we've got the leg finished now, we've got the foot on, and I've put it around the right way so that we can check that it still goes on. It has to go on the other leg then because the foot's the other shape. The only final things you'd have to do is cut the buttonholes, which I'll show you in a moment, and then hem the top. So the last things you've got to do is hem the top. That is allowable to do it on a machine, as they're rarely seen. I have to admit, I prefer to hand hem mine because I find they come out a bit neater. And then I'm also using mine on displays often, and therefore I am showing all of it. But it is fine if you do just want to whiz them out on a machine. And then you need to buttonhole them. The buttonholes, you need to have 2 of them, and you're just making a line to cut them. You need to leave room for where the hemming is going to be. So I might even want to move them just a little bit further down there. Sometimes it is easier to draw these once they're hemmed, but that'll be absolutely fine. If you have them too close, they'll cut through. And all you're doing is cutting a straight line. You're not cutting out an oval or anything like that. So therefore I'm just cutting them. One like that. I like to make them big enough for my thumb to go through, then I know I've got it right. And if you're unsure of the buttonholing stitch, there is also a video showing you how to do that. So big enough. Oh, that one's going to go slightly bigger.